The day Margaret buried her parents, Eleanor Whitmore stood at the ranch house door with her arms crossed, watching the 18-year-old girl shovel dirt onto two simple pine coffins. The ranch owner's lip curled as Margaret's black dress strained across her soft middle, her round cheeks wet with tears. Eleanor didn't offer a hand, didn't say a prayer. She simply calculated how much work she could extract from the fat orphan girl before winter came. What Eleanor couldn't see was the fire beginning to kindle behind Margaret's grief-stricken eyes, or how her own son was watching from the stable, his jaw clenched with quiet fury. Margaret had grown up on the Whitmore ranch, daughter of the foreman and the head housekeeper, loved and protected until that terrible morning when a drunk driver crossed the center line on Highway 40. Now she stood completely alone in a world that had suddenly turned cold. But grief has a strange way of revealing who people truly are, and in the months to come, this ranch would witness a transformation that would shake its foundations and prove that a woman's worth has nothing to do with her waistline. If you believe in second chances and the kind of love that sees beyond the surface, hit that like button and follow this channel. Because what I'm about to share with you is a story of cruelty transformed into triumph, of judgment turned to justice, and of a woman who refused to shrink herself for anyone. Now let me tell you how it all began. Margaret Rose Coleman had spent every one of her 18 years on the Whitmore Ranch, a sprawling 2,000-acre property in Montana's Bitterroot Valley, where the mountains touched the sky and the grass rolled like green ocean waves. Her father, Thomas Coleman, had been ranch foreman for 20 years, a man who could gentle the wildest horse and fix any machine with baling wire and determination. Her mother, Sarah, had run the ranch house with quiet efficiency, keeping the books, managing the staff, and cooking meals that made cowboys weep with gratitude. Margaret had absorbed her mother's gift with food, like osmosis, spending countless afternoons in that vast kitchen, learning to coax magic from simple ingredients. At 5'4" and 200 pounds, with curves that society deemed excessive and cheeks that dimpled when she smiled, Margaret moved through the world apologizing for taking up space. But in the kitchen she was fearless, a conductor orchestrating symphonies of flavor that made people close their eyes and remember home. Her parents had loved her unconditionally, had told her daily that she was beautiful, that her body was strong and capable, that her heart was her greatest asset. Then on a Tuesday morning in late August, they were gone. The funeral was small, attended by ranch hands who had worked alongside her father and neighboring families who had known the Colemans for decades. Eleanor Whitmore appeared in black designer clothes that cost more than Margaret's parents had earned in 6 months, her perfectly maintained blonde hair untouched by the wind that whipped through the cemetery. She stood apart from the mourners, checking her phone twice during the service, her expression one of inconvenience rather than sorrow. Her husband, James Whitmore, stood beside her with his hat over his heart, his weathered face lined with genuine grief. Their son, Daniel, 24 years old and home from agricultural college for the summer, watched Margaret's shoulders shake with sobs and felt something crack open in his chest. He remembered her as a child, always trailing after her parents with flour on her nose, always ready with a shy smile. Now she looked so utterly alone that it physically hurt to witness. After the last prayer, Eleanor approached Margaret with the emotional warmth of a tax auditor. "You'll need to clear out your parents' cottage by the end of the week," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "We'll need the space for the new foreman and his family." Margaret's world narrowed to that single moment, the cruelty of it stealing her breath. The cottage where she had learned to walk, where her mother had sung her to sleep, where her father had taught her to tie her boots, was being taken from her before the dirt had settled on their graves. "But where will I go?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Eleanor's eyes swept over Margaret's body with undisguised distaste, lingering on her round stomach and thick thighs. "That's not really my concern, dear. Your parents didn't leave much, did they? No savings to speak of. I suppose you could find work in town, though I can't imagine who would hire someone in your condition." The word dripped with venom. and Margaret felt 20 years of careful confidence her parents had built begin to crumble. James Whitmore stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Eleanor, for God's sake, the girl just buried her parents." But his wife waved him off with a manicured hand. "Sentimentality doesn't run a ranch, James. You know that." Daniel watched his mother walk away, disgust rolling through him in waves. This was the woman who had raised him, who went to church every Sunday and chaired the county charity board, yet she couldn't spare an ounce of compassion for an orphaned girl. Something had to change. The cottage clearing was torture. Margaret packed 18 years of memories into boxes, her hands shaking as she folded her mother's aprons, wrapped her father's favorite coffee mug, touched the doorframe where her height had been marked every birthday. Ranch hands stopped by to help, their eyes averted, their condolences awkward but sincere. They slipped her cash they couldn't afford, offered couches in town, promised her parents had been good people. But when the sun set on Friday, Margaret had nowhere to go. She sat on the cottage steps with her belongings piled around her, watching the sky turn purple and gold, feeling more lost than she had ever imagined possible. That's when James Whitmore found her, his kind eyes crinkled with concern. "Margaret," he said gently, sitting beside her on the steps, "you can't sleep out here. Come on up to the main house. We'll figure something out." She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but pride is a luxury the desperate can't afford. She followed him through the twilight, carrying a single suitcase, feeling like a beggar at a banquet. Eleanor met them at the kitchen door, her expression thunderous. "Absolutely not," Eleanor hissed, blocking the entrance to the main house as if Margaret carried plague. "We are not running a charity for every stray that wanders onto our property." James's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "This stray is the daughter of two people who gave us 20 years of loyal service. Her father died fixing the north fence line because it needed doing. Her mother managed this household better than anyone before or since. You will show some respect." But Eleanor was unmoved, her eyes calculating as they swept over Margaret again. "Fine, she can stay, but she'll earn her keep. The bunkhouse chef quit last month, and the men are complaining about the food. If she's as good a cook as her mother claimed, she can feed the crew." She paused, her smile turning cruel. "And she can sleep in the attic. It's hot up there. Maybe she'll sweat off some of that weight. God knows she needs to if she ever wants to find a husband." Margaret felt the words land like physical blows, each one finding the soft, vulnerable places where her self-worth lived. James opened his mouth to protest, but Margaret touched his arm gently. "It's fine, Mr. Whitmore. I'm grateful for the work. I'm grateful for somewhere to sleep." Her voice was steady, but inside she was screaming. The attic was exactly as Eleanor described, a sweltering box under the ranch house roof where the heat collected like a punishment. A single narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that stuck halfway open were the only furnishings. The temperature had to be 95 degrees, maybe more, and the air was thick enough to chew. Margaret set down her suitcase and sat on the bed, springs creaking under her weight. This was her life now. No parents, no home, no future beyond servitude to a woman who hated her for the crime of existing in a body that didn't meet arbitrary standards. She lay back on the thin mattress, sweat already beading on her forehead, and let herself cry. Not the pretty crying of movies, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone whose world had collapsed. She cried for her parents, for her lost childhood, for the loneliness that stretched ahead like an endless road. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, until exhaustion finally dragged her into fitful sleep. What Margaret didn't know was that Daniel Whitmore stood in the hallway below, listening to her sobs, his hands clenched into fists, and his heart breaking for a girl who deserved so much better than his mother's cruelty. The next morning, Margaret descended to the ranch kitchen at 4:30, determined to prove her worth. If cooking was all she had left, she would make it count. The kitchen was industrial, designed to feed 20 ranch hands 3 meals a day, with commercial ranges, a walk-in refrigerator, and enough counter space to land a plane. Margaret tied on her mother's apron, the fabric still smelling faintly of vanilla and cinnamon, and began to work. She made biscuits from scratch, the kind that pulled apart in fluffy layers, golden and buttered. She fried bacon until it was perfectly crisp, scrambled eggs with cream and chives, made hash browns that were crispy outside and tender inside. She brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and set out homemade jam her mother had canned last summer. When the ranch hands filed in at 6, expecting the usual barely edible slop, they stopped, dead at the smell. "Good Lord," breathed Tommy Rodriguez, the oldest hand. "That smells like heaven." Margaret served them with quiet efficiency, refilling coffee, making sure everyone had enough. The men ate in reverent silence, then in growing amazement, then with increasing enthusiasm. By the time they pushed back from the table, they were looking at Margaret like she had performed a miracle. "Ma'am," said Tommy, his weathered face serious, "that was the best breakfast I've had in 20 years of ranch work. You got a gift." Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway as Margaret was washing dishes, her expression sour despite the obvious success of the meal. "The men seem satisfied," she said, the words costing her. "You'll prepare all 3 meals daily, breakfast at 6, lunch at noon packed in coolers for the range crew, dinner at 7. You'll do the grocery ordering and manage the kitchen budget, and you'll keep this kitchen spotless." She paused, her eyes sweeping over Margaret's flushed face and sweat-dampened hair. "Try not to eat everything you cook. You're already big enough." The casual cruelty was breathtaking, delivered in the same tone as the work instructions, as if Margaret's body was simply another management concern. Margaret's hands stilled in the dishwater, soap bubbles clinging to her fingers. She wanted to scream, wanted to throw something, wanted to demand why this woman hated her so intensely. Instead, she said quietly, "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," because she had nowhere else to go, and dignity was another luxury she couldn't afford. Eleanor swept out, leaving Margaret alone with the dishes and her humiliation. She gripped the edge of the sink, breathing deeply, refusing to cry. She had survived losing her parents. She would survive this too. What she didn't notice was Daniel watching from the mudroom, his jaw tight with anger, already planning how to make his mother's cruelty stop. Margaret's days fell into a brutal rhythm. She woke at 4 in the suffocating attic heat, already sweating before her feet hit the floor. She cooked breakfast for 20 men, cleaned the kitchen, planned lunch, cooked lunch, cleaned again, started dinner prep, cooked dinner, cleaned until everything gleamed, and finally dragged herself back to the attic sometime after 9. The heat never lessened, turning her sleeping space into a torture chamber designed to prove Eleanor's point, that she needed to shrink, to disappear, to take up less room in the world. But Margaret didn't shrink. She poured her pain and loneliness into her cooking, creating meals that made hardened cowboys get misty-eyed. She made her mother's pot roast with vegetables that melted on the tongue, her father's favorite apple pie with a crust so flaky it practically floated off the plate. She made bread that perfumed the whole house, stews that could cure any sadness, desserts that made grown men fight over seconds. The ranch hands began lingering after meals, not just for the food, but for her quiet kindness, the way she remembered how each man took his coffee, the way she always made sure the vegetarian options were just as delicious as the meat dishes. They started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen counter, offering to help with dishes, protecting her from Eleanor's barbs when they could. In a house where she was meant to feel worthless, Margaret was becoming beloved. But Eleanor's campaign of humiliation was relentless. She commented on Margaret's weight daily, made sure visitors knew the fat girl was just kitchen help, forced Margaret to eat meals, standing up in the kitchen rather than sitting with the family. She gave Margaret her old clothes that wouldn't fit, saying they might motivate her to slim down. She made jokes about Margaret breaking furniture, about buying reinforced chairs, about how the ranch was going through food faster with Margaret around. Each comment was delivered with a smile, in front of others, designed to maximize shame. James protested, arguing with his wife behind closed doors, but Eleanor was immovable. "That girl is a reminder of mediocrity," she told her husband coldly. "Her parents were employees, nothing more. She needs to understand her place." James looked at his wife as if seeing a stranger, wondering when she had become so cruel, but he didn't have the strength to override her completely. He tried to compensate by being kind to Margaret, by praising her cooking, by slipping her extra money from his own wallet. But kindness from him couldn't erase cruelty from her. Margaret began to believe Eleanor's words, began to see herself as the burden, the problem, the fat girl who didn't deserve better. She stopped looking in mirrors, stopped hoping for anything beyond survival. The light in her eyes, the one her parents had carefully nurtured, began to dim. That's when Daniel decided enough was enough. Daniel Whitmore had spent most of his life trying to live up to his father's quiet integrity while avoiding his mother's calculating coldness. At 24, with a degree in agricultural business and a real passion for sustainable ranching, he had planned to modernize the family operation and eventually take over management. But watching his mother systematically destroy a grieving girl's spirit was forcing him to question everything about the world he'd grown up in. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning when he walked into the kitchen to find Margaret collapsed against the counter, her face pale and slick with sweat. "Margaret!" He rushed forward, catching her elbow as she swayed. "When's the last time you drank water? When's the last time you ate?" She blinked at him slowly, confusion crossing her features. I had coffee this morning, I think." Daniel's anger ignited like a wildfire. His mother was working this girl literally to death in a superheated attic while criticizing her weight. The hypocrisy was staggering, the cruelty unfathomable. He guided Margaret to a chair, forced her to sit, poured her a tall glass of cold water, and made her drink it. "You're taking a break," he said firmly. "The ranch hands can survive on sandwiches for lunch. You're going to eat, rest, and let me help you." Margaret tried to protest, fear flickering in her eyes. "Your mother will be furious. She says I need to earn my keep, that I eat too much as it is, that I should be grateful for the work." "Stop!" Daniel's voice was sharp, cutting through her panic. "My mother is wrong about all of it. You're not eating too much, you're not eating enough while working yourself sick. You're not too fat, you're perfect exactly as you are, and you deserve so much better than this." The words hung in the air between them, and Margaret stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Nobody had told her she was perfect since her parents died. Nobody had looked at her with anything but pity or disgust. But Daniel's eyes held something else entirely: respect, concern, and the beginnings of admiration. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "You barely know me." Daniel pulled up a chair and sat across from her, his weathered hands folded on the kitchen table. "I know you've been dealt a terrible hand. I know my mother is treating you in a way that would make Jesus himself flip tables. And I know that your cooking is the best thing that's happened to this ranch in years, which means you have a gift worth protecting." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I also know what it's like to feel like you don't measure up to someone's impossible standards. My mother's been trying to mold me into her vision of the perfect son my whole life. I understand what that does to a person." For the first time since her parents' funeral, Margaret felt something other than grief and shame. She felt anger, clean, hot, righteous anger at the injustice of it all. Her parents had worked themselves to the bone for the Whitmores, had given their lives in service to this ranch, and she was being treated like garbage because her body didn't conform to Eleanor's aesthetic preferences. The anger felt good, felt powerful, felt like waking up after a long, drugged sleep. "I'm a good cook," she said slowly, testing the words. "I'm a really good cook. Better than good. My mother trained me. I could work anywhere." Daniel's face broke into a grin. "Now you're getting it. You could work anywhere. So why are you letting my mother convince you that you're lucky to sleep in an attic and be insulted daily?" The question unlocked something in Margaret's chest. And suddenly she was crying again. But these were different tears, tears of rage and relief and recognition. "Because I have nowhere else to go," she admitted. "I have $400 to my name and no references except your father. I'm terrified that if I leave, I'll end up homeless, and at least here I have a bed and food and daily humiliation and exploitation," Daniel finished. "Margaret, that's not living. That's surviving barely. You deserve better." That conversation became the first of many. Daniel started appearing in the kitchen during Margaret's prep work, ostensibly to grab coffee, but really to talk. He asked about her childhood, her parents, her dreams before grief had stolen them. Margaret, starved for kindness and genuine interest, slowly began to open up. She told him about learning to bake with her mother, about the small notebooks where she'd written down recipe ideas and menu plans, about her secret dream of maybe, someday, running her own restaurant. "Why secret?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Because fat girls aren't supposed to dream about food careers. People assume we're already too obsessed with eating. Your mother made that very clear." Daniel's expression darkened. "My mother is a snob and a bully. Her opinions on your body or your career potential are worth exactly nothing." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "Margaret, I've eaten in 5-star restaurants in Denver and Seattle. None of them hold a candle to what you create in this kitchen. You're wasting your talent here, letting my mother's poison convince you that you're anything less than extraordinary." The words burrowed into Margaret's heart, taking root in soil that her parents had prepared. But that grief had left fallow. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to accept Eleanor's vision of her future. Daniel's interest in Margaret didn't go unnoticed. Eleanor watched her son lingering in the kitchen with mounting horror and rage. The idea that her son, her handsome, educated, eligible son, might be attracted to the fat orphan girl was unthinkable. She began her counteroffensive with surgical precision. She invited eligible daughters of neighboring ranchers for dinner, parading them in front of Daniel like livestock. She made sure Margaret served these meals, forcing her to watch as thin, beautiful women flirted with Daniel over food Margaret had prepared. She increased Margaret's workload, assigning her additional cleaning duties that kept her too exhausted to talk. She moved Margaret's dinner hour to after the family ate, ensuring they never shared a table. And she escalated her verbal abuse, calling Margaret the help in front of Daniel, making weight jokes, sighing dramatically about food costs. "I swear, James," she said loudly one evening as Margaret cleared dishes, "we're going through twice as much food since Margaret started cooking. I suppose we know where it's all going." The comment was designed to wound, and it did. Margaret's hands trembled as she carried plates to the kitchen, Eleanor's laughter following her like a curse. But this time, Daniel didn't let it slide. "That's enough." Daniel's voice cut through the dining room like a whip, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Eleanor's smile froze on her perfectly made-up face. "Excuse me?" Her tone was dangerous, but Daniel stood his ground. "I said that's enough. Your constant criticism of Margaret's weight is cruel, it's unproductive, and I won't tolerate it anymore in my presence." He turned to his father. "Dad, are you going to allow this to continue?" James Whitmore had been watching his wife's behavior with increasing disgust, the final thread of his patience fraying. "Eleanor, our son is right. Your treatment of Margaret has crossed every line of decency. It stops now." Eleanor's face flushed with rage. "How dare you both? I'm trying to maintain standards in this house, trying to prevent your son from making a catastrophic mistake." "Mistake?" Daniel's laugh was harsh. "The only mistake here is your belief that a person's worth is determined by their dress size. Margaret is kind, talented, hard-working, and frankly too good for this family. If anyone should be ashamed, it's you." The words hung in the air like a bomb, and Eleanor's carefully maintained composure cracked. She stood abruptly, throwing her napkin on the table. "You'll regret this," she hissed at Daniel. "Both of you will." She stormed from the room, and in the kitchen, Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. not of sadness this time, but of shocked gratitude. After that confrontation, Daniel made it his mission to spend time with Margaret, to show her the beauty of the ranch that her work schedule had kept her from seeing. He started appearing in the kitchen after dinner, when the cleaning was done, asking if she wanted to go for a drive. The first time, Margaret refused, certain it was a joke or a trick. The second time, Daniel simply waited, leaning against the doorframe with his hat in his hands and his eyes patient. The third time, exhausted and lonely and desperately needing to see something other than four walls and Eleanor's disgusted face, Margaret agreed. Daniel led her to the barn, where an old-fashioned wooden carriage waited, the kind used for ranch tours and special occasions. "I thought you might like to see the property the way it's meant to be seen," he said simply, "not as a place you're trapped, but as a place of beauty." He helped her up onto the bench seat, his hand steady and respectful, and then climbed up beside her. The evening was cool and clear, the sun setting in bands of orange and purple, and as the horses pulled them into the hills, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. Daniel drove them to the north pasture, where the Rocky Mountains rose like a cathedral against the sky. He showed her the creek, where he'd learned to fish as a boy, the meadow where wildflowers grew in riotous profusion, the ancient oak tree where his father had proposed to his mother back when she'd been a different person. He talked about his dreams for the ranch, his ideas about sustainable agriculture and ethical animal husbandry, his plans to build something that honored the land rather than just exploited it. And he asked Margaret about her dreams, really asked, leaning forward to listen as if her words were precious. "I used to imagine opening a restaurant," Margaret admitted, her voice soft as the evening air. "Something small and elegant, where every dish was made with love and attention. Where people didn't just eat but experience something. My mom used to say that food was a language, a way to say, 'You matter,' and 'You're welcome,' and 'Let me take care of you.' I wanted to speak that language for a living." Her voice broke slightly. "But that feels impossible now. I can barely afford to stay alive, much less start a business." Daniel was quiet for a moment, the horse's hooves the only sound. Then he said, "What if it wasn't impossible? What if someone believed in you enough to help make it happen?" The question hung between them, fragile and full of possibility. Margaret turned to look at Daniel, really look at him, and saw something in his eyes that made her heart stutter. This wasn't pity. This wasn't charity. This was something else entirely, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" Daniel's smile was gentle. "Because everyone deserves a champion, Margaret. Everyone deserves someone who sees their potential and helps them reach it. And because," he paused, seeming to gather courage, "because I see you. Not the version my mother tries to make you, not the girl who's lost and grieving, but the strong, talented, beautiful woman you actually are. And I think that woman could change the world with a kitchen and a chance." Beautiful. The word echoed in Margaret's head like a bell, like a revelation, like a lie she desperately wanted to believe. Nobody had called her beautiful since her parents died. Nobody looked at her body and saw anything but a problem to be solved, a before picture waiting for an after. But Daniel's eyes held no judgment, no disappointment, no disgust. He looked at her like she was a sunset, something worth stopping to appreciate, something extraordinary. They talked until stars filled the sky, the horses dozing in their traces, the ranch spread out below them like a quilt of shadow and silver. Daniel told her about the small commercial building in town that had been for lease for 6 months, how it had a perfect kitchen already installed from the previous restaurant that failed. He told her about small business loans and how his father might be willing to co-sign, about how the ranch could be her first major client, providing steady income while she built a reputation. He told her he believed she could succeed, that he'd help however he could, that she didn't have to face the future alone. And Margaret, for the first time since her parents' accident, let herself hope. The drive back to the ranch house was quiet, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts, but it was a comfortable silence. Daniel helped her down from the carriage, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary, and Margaret climbed the stairs to her sweltering attic room with something new burning in her chest: determination. Eleanor Whitmore could try to break her, but she wouldn't succeed. Not anymore. The next morning, Margaret attacked her work with renewed energy, but she also did something she'd never done before. She took breaks. She drank water. She saved herself a plate of food and ate it slowly, savoring each bite, reminding herself that nourishment wasn't a sin. She stood up straighter, lifted her chin higher, met the ranch hand's eyes when they complimented her cooking instead of deflecting. And when Eleanor made her daily weight comment, "Goodness, Margaret, are those pants getting tighter?" Margaret smiled sweetly and said, "I wouldn't know, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm too busy creating meals that people actually enjoy to worry about your fashion opinions." The shocked silence that followed was delicious. Eleanor's face went through several colors before settling on an angry red. "How dare you!" But James Whitmore, who'd been reading the paper at the kitchen table, let out a surprised laugh. "She's got you there, Eleanor. Maybe focus on something more productive than critiquing the help's wardrobe." He winked at Margaret, who felt a surge of affection for the older man. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that meant something. Eleanor swept from the room in high dudgeon, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: pride. Daniel started appearing more frequently, sometimes with his father in tow, both men clearly coordinating their efforts to protect Margaret from Eleanor's wrath. They ate their meals in the kitchen, praising each dish extravagantly, asking Margaret about her inspirations and techniques. James turned out to be a food enthusiast, telling stories about the best meals he'd had traveling for cattle auctions, comparing Margaret favorably to famous chefs. "You've got something special, young lady," he told her seriously. "A gift like yours shouldn't be wasted feeding ranch hands. No offense to the men. You should be feeding the world." The validation from someone she respected meant everything. James also started asking Margaret to prepare special meals for business dinners, showing her off to visiting ranchers and ag suppliers. Word began to spread about the Whitmore Ranch's incredible cook, and soon Margaret was fielding requests to cater events, to share recipes, to teach cooking classes. Eleanor tried to shut it all down, forbidding Margaret from taking outside work, but James overruled her. "The girl needs to build a future," he said firmly. "We won't stand in her way." The cracks in his parents' marriage were becoming canyons, and Daniel watched with mixed feelings. He hated that his family was fracturing, but he couldn't deny that his mother's true nature needed to be exposed. One evening, Daniel asked Margaret to go for another carriage ride, but this time the destination was different. He drove them into town, to a small brick building on Main Street with a "For Lease" sign in the window. "Come on," he said, helping her down. "I want you to see something." The interior was perfect. A commercial kitchen with professional ranges, a beautiful dining room with exposed brick and tin ceilings, even an outdoor patio for summer dining. Margaret walked through the space with her heart pounding, touching the counters, imagining the dishes she could create here, the lives she could touch with her food. "It's 3,000 square feet, Daniel said, watching her face. "The previous owners spent a fortune on the kitchen before they went under. Bad management, not bad food. The landlord is desperate to fill it. The rent is reasonable, and with the ranch as an anchor client, you'd have steady income while building your reputation." He pulled out a folder of paperwork. "Dad and I worked up some numbers. With a small business loan that Dad would co-sign, you could open in 3 months. Margaret's hands shook as she took the folder, tears blurring her vision. "Daniel, I can't ask you to do this. It's too much, too generous." "You're not asking," he interrupted gently. "I'm offering. Actually, I'm begging. Please let me help you build something amazing. Please let me be part of your dream." The emotion in his voice made Margaret look up sharply, and what she saw in Daniel's face stopped her breath. This wasn't just about helping an underdog or thwarting his mother's cruelty. Daniel's feelings had crossed into territory neither of them had acknowledged, and suddenly the air between them was charged with possibility and danger. "Daniel," she whispered, Your mother will never accept this. She'll fight it, fight us, make both our lives hell. Let her try, he said fiercely. I'm done living my life according to her prejudices and shallow values. I'm done watching her hurt people I care about. Margaret, you make me want to be better. You make me believe in doing the right thing even when it's hard. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you. The word hung between them. You, loaded with meaning. Neither was quite ready to name. Margaret felt her heart expanding and breaking simultaneously. This man, this good, handsome, privileged man saw her, really saw her. Not her weight, not her poverty, not her lack of connections. He saw her talent, her heart, her worth. And he was offering her not just a business opportunity, but partnership, friendship, maybe even something more. It was terrifying and wonderful and too good to be true. I need to think, she managed, even though every cell in her body was screaming, yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. This is a huge decision, life-changing. I need to be sure, Daniel nodded, understanding and respect in his eyes. Take all the time you need. The building isn't going anywhere, and neither am I. Whatever you decide, I'm here. Margaret spent the next week in a state of barely contained excitement and terror. She studied the business plan Daniel and James had created, running numbers until her eyes crossed, researching health permits and business licenses, sketching menu ideas in the notebook she'd started keeping by her bed. The dream that had seemed impossible was suddenly tangible, close enough to touch, and it made her feel alive in a way she hadn't since her parents died. But Eleanor was watching, plotting, preparing her counterattack. The confrontation came on a Friday evening when Margaret was preparing dinner. Eleanor swept into the kitchen with two elegantly dressed women in tow, clearly friends from her charity board. "Ladies, this is our cook," Eleanor said, her voice dripping false sweetness. "Margaret, say hello to Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen. They were curious about the girl my son has taken such an inexplicable interest in." Margaret straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, her stomach clenching with dread. "Nice to meet you," she managed. The women's eyes swept over her body, their expressions politely masked, but their judgment clear. "Oh my," Mrs. Patterson murmured. "She's rather substantial, isn't she?" Eleanor's smile was triumphant. "Yes, sadly. We've tried to encourage healthier habits, but some people just can't help themselves. It's genetic, I suppose. Her mother was quite large as well." The casual cruelty, delivered in front of strangers, was designed to humiliate, and it worked. Margaret felt heat flood her face, felt the familiar shame trying to drag her under. But then she remembered Daniel's words. "You're perfect exactly as you are. You have a gift. You deserve better." And the shame transmuted into something harder, stronger. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret said clearly, her voice steady despite her pounding heart, "my mother was a beautiful woman who taught me that a person's worth isn't determined by their waistline. She also taught me that cruelty says more about the person delivering it than the person receiving it." The silence that fell was absolute. Eleanor's face went white with shock, then red with fury. "How dare you speak to me that way in my own home?" "Your home where I work 16-hour days," Margaret interrupted, her confidence growing with each word. "Your home where I create meals that your ranch hands say are the best they've ever eaten. Your home where your own husband praises my cooking while you criticize my body. I'm done apologizing for existing, Mrs. Whitmore, and I'm done accepting your abuse." The shocked expressions on the women's faces were almost comical. Mrs. Chen's eyes had gone wide, and Mrs. Patterson's mouth hung slightly open. They hadn't expected the fat kitchen girl to have a spine, much less to use it. Eleanor seemed to vibrate with rage. "You're fired," she spat. "Pack your things and get out of my house immediately." But James Whitmore appeared in the doorway, his expression thunderous. "Nobody's firing anybody," he said coldly. "Eleanor, a word, now." He turned to the guests. "Ladies, I apologize for my wife's behavior. Margaret is a valued member of our household and deserves respect. Perhaps you should leave." The dismissal was clear, and the women gathered their purses and fled, likely already composing the gossip they'd spread across the county. Eleanor followed James into his office, her heels clicking like gunshots on the hardwood floor. Through the closed door, the ranch hands clustered in the dining room could hear raised voices, could hear James's controlled anger meeting Eleanor's shrill justifications. Daniel appeared at Margaret's elbow, his face fierce with pride. "That was incredible," he said quietly. "You were incredible. Are you okay?" Margaret found she was shaking, adrenaline flooding her system, but she was also smiling. "I'm better than okay," she realized. "I just stood up to the person who's made my life hell for months, and it felt amazing." The argument in James's office escalated, and suddenly both ranch owner and his wife emerged, their faces masks of carefully controlled emotion. James's expression was set in stone. "Margaret," he said formally, "I apologize for my wife's treatment of you. It's been unacceptable from the beginning, and I should have put a stop to it sooner. You have a standing offer of employment here for as long as you want it, with a raise effective immediately, and accommodations in the newly renovated guest house, not that attic hellhole." He turned to Eleanor, his voice like iron. "And my wife will be apologizing to you directly." Eleanor looked like she'd rather eat glass, but James's stance made it clear this wasn't optional. "I apologize for any offense," she managed, each word seemingly causing her physical pain. "I may have been overly critical." "Overly critical?" Daniel's voice was sharp. "Mother, you've bullied and humiliated Margaret from the day her parents died. You've made comments about her weight daily, forced her to work in inhumane conditions, and tried to convince her she was worthless. That's not overly critical. That's abuse." Eleanor's composure cracked completely. "I will not be lectured by my own son about how to run my household." "It's not your household," James interrupted. "It's our household, and it's also our family's business. And you've been damaging both with your prejudice and cruelty. It stops now, or you and I are going to have a much bigger conversation about our future together." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Eleanor finally seemed to grasp that she'd pushed too far. Her husband, who had tolerated her snobbery for years, was drawing a line. Her son was choosing the fat orphan over her. Her carefully constructed social standing was cracking because she couldn't keep her vicious tongue in check. She looked around the room at the faces staring back at her, James's disappointment, Daniel's disgust, Margaret's quiet triumph, and for the first time in years, Eleanor Whitmore felt fear. "Fine," she said tightly. "I'll try to be more considerate." It wasn't a real apology, but it was surrender, and everyone recognized it as such. Margaret found her voice. "Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate that, but I won't be needing your consideration much longer. I'm moving out." She turned to Daniel. "If your offer is still open, I'd like to take it. I want to open my restaurant. I want to build something of my own." The joy that transformed Daniel's face was like sunrise. "The offer is absolutely still open. When do you want to start?" Margaret thought of the sweltering attic, the daily insults, the months of being made to feel small. She thought of her parents, who had raised her to believe in herself, and she thought of the brick building on Main Street, waiting to be filled with the smell of her cooking and the warmth of her welcome. "Monday," she said firmly. "I want to start Monday." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel and Margaret met with the landlord, signed the lease, and began renovating the space. James contributed not just as a co-signer, but as an investor, taking a small equity stake and ensuring that Margaret's salary from the ranch would continue until the restaurant was profitable. He also strong-armed several of his business associates into making reservations for the opening, guaranteeing a solid first night. The ranch hands volunteered to help with renovations, showing up after their shifts to paint, build tables, and install light fixtures. Margaret moved into the apartment above the restaurant, a small but clean space that was entirely hers, the first place she'd lived that didn't belong to someone else. She spent hours designing the menu, testing recipes, perfecting every detail. She decided to call the restaurant Coleman's Kitchen, honoring her parents and the legacy of love they'd built. Daniel was there for all of it, working alongside her, offering suggestions, celebrating small victories, and providing a steady, supportive presence that Margaret was becoming dangerously dependent on. Their friendship was deepening into something neither could ignore, manifested in lingering glances and hands that found excuses to touch. Eleanor, meanwhile, was conspicuously absent, nursing her wounded pride and plotting her revenge. She spread rumors around town about Margaret's restaurant, questioning whether anyone so young and inexperienced could possibly succeed, making subtle comments about hygiene standards and untrained cooks. She tried to forbid Daniel from continuing to help, which he ignored completely. She attempted to withdraw James's financial support, which he refused. She even considered reporting the restaurant to health inspectors before it opened, but James made it clear that would be the final straw in their marriage. Eleanor was losing control, and it made her desperate. The night before the restaurant's opening, Margaret stood in the empty dining room, looking at the fruits of her labor. Fresh flowers on every table, candles ready to light, the kitchen stocked with the finest ingredients she could source, the menu printed on heavy cardstock. Everything was ready, except her. The fear that she'd suppressed for weeks suddenly hit like a tidal wave. What if nobody came? What if Eleanor's gossip had poisoned the town against her? What if she failed spectacularly and proved that Eleanor had been right all along, that a fat orphan with no connections had no business dreaming this big? She sat down at one of the tables, dropped her head into her hands, and felt tears threatening. That's when Daniel found her. "Hey," he said softly, pulling up a chair. "What's wrong?" Margaret gestured helplessly at the beautiful space around them. "I'm terrified. What if this was all a mistake? What if I'm not good enough?" Daniel took her hands, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with surprising gentleness. "Margaret Coleman, you are more than good enough. You're extraordinary. And tomorrow night, you're going to prove it to everyone, including yourself." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Can I tell you something?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Daniel took a deep breath. "When I first came home this summer, I thought I knew what I wanted. To take over the ranch, to marry someone appropriate, to build the life my mother had planned for me. Then your parents died, and I watched you grieve. I watched my mother try to destroy you, and I watched you survive it all with a grace and strength that humbled me." His voice grew husky with emotion. "Somewhere in the middle of all that, I fell in love with you. With your kindness to the ranch hands, with your dedication to perfection in your cooking, with your courage in standing up to my mother, with your dreams and your heart, and yes, with your beautiful body that you've been taught to hate, but that I think is absolutely perfect." He lifted her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I love you, Margaret. And regardless of what happens with this restaurant, regardless of what anyone else thinks, I want to spend my life showing you how extraordinary you are." Margaret's tears spilled over, but these were good tears, healing tears, tears of a heart being offered something it had thought impossible. "You love me," she whispered. "Even though I'm perfect?" Daniel finished. "Yes, even though you're perfect, especially because you're perfect. Margaret, I don't see your weight when I look at you. I see courage and talent and beauty and everything I want in a partner." Margaret had spent so long being told she was too much, too big, too visible, too demanding of space. Eleanor's campaign of degradation had nearly convinced her that she deserved less than other people, that she should be grateful for crumbs of respect and slivers of opportunity. But Daniel was offering her everything: love and partnership, and the radical acceptance of being seen and valued exactly as she was. It was terrifying and overwhelming and more than she'd ever dared to dream. "I love you too," she admitted, the words feeling like a revolution. "I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but I love you. You make me believe I deserve good things. You make me feel beautiful." Daniel's smile could have powered a city. He stood, pulling her to her feet, and then he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, reverent and sweet, a kiss that promised tomorrow and forever, a kiss that tasted like hope. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "Let's go home," Daniel said. "You need rest before the big day. And Margaret, I'll be in the first seat tomorrow night, and I'll be there every night after for as long as you'll have me." They walked out into the Montana night, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next together. The transformation was complete. The fat orphan girl who had been humiliated and dismissed had become a restaurant owner, a survivor, and a woman loved. Tomorrow, she would show the world what she was capable of. Tonight, she would rest in the certainty that she was enough. Opening night at Coleman's Kitchen arrived with perfect weather, cool enough to be comfortable, clear enough that the mountains stood sharp against the twilight sky. Margaret had barely slept, her mind racing with last-minute details and what-if scenarios. But when she descended to the restaurant kitchen at 3 in the afternoon, her hands were steady and her heart was determined. She put on her chef's whites, custom-made to fit her curves perfectly, professional and beautiful, and tied her hair back with her mother's favorite scarf. Today, she would honor her parents' memory by being exactly who they had raised her to be: excellent. Daniel arrived an hour before opening with his father, both men dressed in their Sunday best and carrying enormous bouquets of wildflowers. "For the tables," James said gruffly, but his eyes were shining with pride. "And for you," Daniel added, handing Margaret a single perfect rose, "to match the blush in your cheeks and the fire in your heart." The sweetness of it made Margaret laugh, and the laughter banished the last of her nerves. She was ready. By 5:30, a line had formed outside the restaurant, and Margaret peeked through the kitchen door in disbelief. Ranch hands in their best shirts, neighboring ranchers and their families, business owners from town, even Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen, the women who'd witnessed Eleanor's humiliation, waited to be seated. Word of mouth about Margaret's talent had spread faster than Eleanor's gossip, and people were curious. Daniel worked the front of house, greeting guests and seating them with practiced charm, while Margaret commanded the kitchen like a general directing troops. She'd hired 2 young cooks from the community college culinary program, both of whom watched her with awe as she orchestrated 6 simultaneous dishes with calm precision. The first orders went out, and silence fell over the dining room. Margaret had designed the menu to tell a story, her parents' story, the story of Montana itself. She served elk tenderloin with huckleberry reduction, honoring the land's wild bounty. She made her mother's famous pot roast, but elevated it with red wine and herbe de Provence, traditional meat sophisticated. She created a salad with local greens, candied walnuts, and house-made blue cheese dressing that made people close their eyes in pleasure. And for dessert, she served her father's favorite apple pie, but presented it deconstructed and modern, with caramel sauce and vanilla bean ice cream. Each dish was a masterpiece, each plate a work of art, and as Margaret watched through the kitchen door, she saw something that made her heart soar. People were crying. Grown men, tough ranchers who'd spent their lives working the land, were getting emotional over her food. Tommy Rodriguez, the oldest hand from the Whitmore Ranch, stood up and applauded when Daniel told him Margaret had cooked everything. By 7 o'clock, they'd already sold out of several dishes and were turning away walk-ins. Coleman's Kitchen was a resounding success, but the best moment came near the end of service when Daniel brought a final guest to the kitchen door. "Margaret," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "there's someone who wants to meet you." Margaret looked up from plating a dessert to see a distinguished older gentleman in an expensive suit. He extended his hand. "Ms. Coleman, my name is Robert Chen. I'm Mrs. Chen's husband and the regional director for the Montana Restaurant Association. I also happen to freelance as a consultant for the Michelin Guide." Margaret's hands went numb. The Michelin Guide, the most prestigious restaurant rating system in the world, had representatives in Montana. She shook his hand automatically, unable to form words. Robert Chen's smile was kind. "I was skeptical when my wife insisted I come tonight. She said she'd witnessed something extraordinary, not just excellent cooking, but a young woman with real backbone standing up to a bully. I'm a sucker for underdog stories, so I came. And Ms. Coleman, what I experienced tonight was exceptional. Your food tells a story. It honors tradition while pushing boundaries. It's technically perfect but emotionally resonant. That's rare, very rare. He pulled out a business card. I'll be submitting a report, but I wanted you to know personally, you should expect Michelin inspectors within the next 6 months. And based on tonight, I'd say you have a real shot at a star, maybe more. Margaret's knees went weak, and Daniel caught her elbow, steadying her. A Michelin star? For her little restaurant in rural Montana? It was impossible, unthinkable, the kind of achievement that changed careers and lives. Thank you, she managed. Thank you so much. Robert tipped his head. Thank your talent, Ms. Coleman, and thank whoever taught you that food is love made visible. That's what I tasted tonight. After the last guest left and the kitchen was cleaned, Margaret, Daniel and James sat at the bar with glasses of champagne, too exhausted and exhilarated to speak. The night had exceeded every expectation, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. James raised his glass. To Margaret Coleman, who took the worst thing that ever happened to her and turned it into triumph. Your parents would be so proud. They drank, and Margaret felt the truth of it settle in her bones. Her parents would be proud. She had honored their memory not by staying small and grateful, but by being bold and demanding the respect she deserved. She had taken Eleanor's cruelty and used it as fuel to build something beautiful. She had survived and thrived and transformed her pain into purpose. Daniel took her hand under the bar, his fingers lacing with hers, and Margaret felt a completeness she hadn't known since before the accident. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't the fat orphan girl sleeping in an attic. She was Margaret Coleman, chef and owner, loved and respected, and nobody, not Eleanor Whitmore or anyone else, could take that away from her. The transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. The weeks following the opening were a blur of sold-out services and growing acclaim. Coleman's Kitchen became the reservation to get in the county, with people booking weeks in advance. Margaret hired additional staff, trained them in her exacting standards, and began to develop a reputation as a demanding but fair boss who treated her employees with dignity and paid them well. She created a scholarship program in her parents' names, offering free culinary training to young people from low-income backgrounds. She started a community meal program, serving free dinners to families in need every Monday when the restaurant was closed to regular customers. Her success wasn't just financial, it was philosophical, a declaration that you could be successful and kind, excellent and generous. Daniel was beside her through all of it, helping with business decisions, managing finances, and providing emotional support when the pressure became intense. Their relationship deepened and strengthened, built on mutual respect and shared values. He loved watching Margaret in her element, commanding the kitchen with confidence, mentoring young cooks, creating art with food. And Margaret loved seeing Daniel grow into himself, no longer trying to please his mother, but instead building a life aligned with his own values. He started working part-time at the restaurant, discovering a talent for hospitality and business management. They were partners in every sense, and the ranch hands joked that you couldn't find a more perfect couple in the whole state of Montana. Eleanor, meanwhile, was facing the consequences of her cruelty. Word had spread through the county about how she'd treated Margaret, and Eleanor found herself increasingly isolated from her social circle. Women who had once competed for her approval now whispered about her behind raised hands. Business associates of James's made pointed comments about treating employees with respect. Even her church group, which she'd chaired for a decade, asked her to step down after several members expressed discomfort with her leadership. Eleanor had built her identity on being the grande dame of the community, and watching it crumble was devastating. James moved into a guest room, making it clear that their marriage existed in name only unless Eleanor made real changes. Daniel barely spoke to her, spending most of his time at the restaurant or with Margaret. Eleanor had gotten exactly what she'd tried to prevent. She'd lost her son and her influence, all because she couldn't accept that a woman's worth had nothing to do with her dress size. The karma was perfect and painful, and some nights Eleanor lay awake wondering how she'd become so twisted that hurting a grieving girl had seemed acceptable. But pride is hard to kill, and apologies are hard to offer, so Eleanor remained isolated in her bitterness, a cautionary tale about the cost of cruelty. 3 months after opening, Margaret received a letter that changed everything. The Michelin Guide was awarding Coleman's Kitchen 1 star in their inaugural Montana edition. 1 star, denoting a very good restaurant and marking Margaret as one of the top chefs in the region. The news hit local and national media, with food writers making pilgrimages to the small Montana town to taste the food, creating such buzz. Margaret's face appeared in magazines. Her story, Orphaned Girl Overcomes Discrimination to Create Award-Winning Restaurant, resonating with people across the country. She was invited to compete on cooking shows, to teach at culinary conferences, to consult with other restaurants. But Margaret remained grounded, never forgetting where she came from or the struggles that had forged her. She used her platform to speak about body positivity in professional kitchens, about the toxic culture that equated thinness with worth. She became an advocate for labor rights in restaurants, for living wages and humane working conditions. Her success was about more than personal triumph. It was about changing systems and expanding possibilities for everyone who'd been told they didn't belong. Daniel watched with pride as the woman he loved became a force for good in the world, her influence rippling outward in ways neither of them had imagined. And every night, when the restaurant closed and they walked home under Montana stars, he thanked whatever cosmic force had brought them together. 6 months after opening, Margaret was ready to take the next step. She'd proven herself, built financial stability, and created something that would outlast her. Now she wanted to do something she'd been dreaming about since opening night. She wanted to expand. She found a second building, this one in a neighboring town, and began developing plans for Sarah's Table, named after her mother and focused on teaching cooking classes and providing catering services. The goal was to create job training programs for women facing barriers to employment, women who were homeless, formerly incarcerated, escaping domestic violence, or like Margaret had been, suddenly alone and desperate. She wanted to give others the chance that Daniel and James had given her, to prove that with training and support, anyone could achieve excellence. Daniel helped her write the business plan. James provided seed funding, and several of Margaret's regular customers stepped up as investors. The community that had watched her triumph wanted to be part of her continued success. Sarah's Table opened to immediate acclaim, and Margaret found herself running 2 successful businesses before she turned 20. She was exhausted and exhilarated, stretched thin but purposeful, building something that honored her parents while creating opportunities for others. She was becoming the person she'd needed when she was lost: mentor, advocate, employer, and proof that your beginning doesn't determine your ending. Meanwhile, Margaret's relationship with Daniel continued to deepen. They'd moved in together above the restaurant, creating a home filled with laughter and good food and quiet evenings after intense days. Daniel proposed on the anniversary of their first carriage ride, taking Margaret back to that meadow where she'd first allowed herself to hope. He got down on one knee in the wildflowers and offered her a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, not his mother's family, but his father's mother, a woman who'd been known for her kindness and her cooking. "Margaret Coleman," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've taught me what it means to love someone for who they truly are. You've shown me that courage looks like standing up even when you're terrified, that strength looks like turning pain into purpose, that beauty has nothing to do with what society says and everything to do with what's in your heart. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life being your partner, your champion, and your biggest fan?" Margaret said yes through happy tears, and they held each other as the sun set over the mountains, 2 people who'd found home in each other. The wedding planning would come later. But in that moment, they were simply present, grateful, and utterly content. Eleanor's opinion on the engagement was not requested or offered, though James privately told Margaret he couldn't be happier with his future daughter-in-law. The family was healing around the wound Eleanor had created, building something new and better from the ashes of her cruelty. As Margaret's first year as a restaurant owner came to a close, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she'd been sleeping in a sweltering attic, convinced she deserved nothing better, allowing Eleanor's poison to seep into her soul. Now she was an award-winning chef, a successful business owner, an employer and mentor, and a woman loved for exactly who she was. Her body hadn't changed significantly. She'd lost some weight from the physical demands of kitchen work and gained some muscle from the constant movement. But she was still fat by any conventional standard. And she didn't care. She'd learned that her body was a vehicle for her talent, her kindness, her love. It was strong enough to work 16-hour days. It was soft enough to provide comfort when someone needed a hug. It was beautiful enough to catch Daniel's eye and hold his heart. It was enough, exactly as it was, and Margaret had stopped apologizing for existing. She dressed in clothes that fit well and felt good. She ate the food she loved without guilt. She moved through the world with confidence, taking up space unapologetically. She had reclaimed her body from the people who'd tried to make her ashamed of it, and in doing so, had reclaimed her entire life. The transformation from humiliated orphan to celebrated chef wasn't about physical change. It was about internal revolution, about refusing to accept someone else's limited vision of who she could be. The second Michelin inspection came during Montana's brutal winter, when the restaurant should have been quiet but was packed every night. The inspector came unannounced, as they always did, and ordered half the menu over the course of 2 visits. Margaret didn't know she was being evaluated. She simply cooked as she always did, with passion and precision and love. 3 months later, the letter arrived. Coleman's kitchen was being upgraded to 2 Michelin stars, denoting excellent cooking and worth a detour. 2 stars, a distinction achieved by less than 10% of Michelin-starred restaurants, marking Margaret as one of the best chefs not just in Montana, but in the entire country. She was 20 years old. Daniel found her crying in the restaurant's office, the letter clutched in her shaking hands. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing," Margaret managed through tears. "Everything is right. Daniel, 2 years ago I thought my life was over. I thought losing my parents meant losing everything, but I survived. I built this, and I did it as myself in this body, without apologizing or shrinking or becoming who someone else thought I should be." She looked up at him, her face shining with tears and triumph. "I did it, Daniel. I actually did it." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as she cried out years of pain and doubt, and finally, pure joy. They had built something extraordinary together, and this was just the beginning. News of the second star brought even more attention. Margaret appeared on national morning shows, was featured in the New York Times food section, received offers from publishers wanting to turn her story into a memoir. She hired a publicist to manage the requests and stayed focused on what mattered, creating excellent food, treating her employees well, and giving back to her community. She expanded Sarah's Table to include a residential program where women could live above the kitchen while completing their training, ensuring they had stability while building new skills. She started a foundation to fund culinary education for people from marginalized communities. She became a voice for change in an industry known for its cruelty and its insistence that women's bodies conform to narrow standards. And through it all, she remained grounded in the values her parents had instilled: kindness, excellence, and the radical belief that everyone deserves dignity. Eleanor's attempt to destroy her had instead launched her into the stratosphere, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. The woman who'd mocked Margaret for being fat and poor and orphaned was now forced to watch as that same girl became one of the most celebrated chefs in America. The reversal was complete, the justice was poetic, and Margaret had done it all without compromising who she was. The third Michelin star came 2 years later, on Margaret's 22nd birthday, and with it came a distinction achieved by fewer than 150 restaurants worldwide. 3 stars, denoting exceptional cuisine worth a special journey. Coleman's Kitchen had joined the ranks of the world's best restaurants, and Margaret Coleman had become the youngest American woman ever to achieve the rating. The news sent shockwaves through the culinary world. A self-taught chef from rural Montana, a woman who'd started with nothing, a fat girl who'd been told she'd never amount to anything, was now mentioned in the same breath as legends. Food critics flew in from Tokyo, Paris, New York, and London. They came expecting novelty, expecting to dismiss the hype, and left humbled by the artistry and heart in every dish. Margaret's food had evolved. She'd learned classical techniques, studied under masters, refined her presentation to museum-quality standards. But at its core, it remained what it had always been: love made visible, comfort translated to flavor, home captured on a plate. She served dishes that made people cry, that reminded them of childhood and family and everything good in the world. And she did it in a restaurant where the staff was paid well, treated respectfully, and given opportunities to grow. Coleman's Kitchen became known not just for its food, but for its values, proof that excellence and ethics weren't mutually exclusive. Eleanor Whitmore received her invitation to the celebration dinner, marking the 3rd star, with a hand-delivered note from James. "This is your opportunity to do the right thing. Don't waste it." She stared at the invitation for a long time, her pride warring with reality. Margaret Coleman, the fat orphan girl she'd humiliated and tried to break, was now one of the most successful chefs in the world. Eleanor's cruelty had been documented in magazine profiles and television interviews, always tactfully mentioned but impossible to ignore. Her name had become synonymous in culinary circles with the kind of toxic elitism the industry was trying to move past. And now Margaret was inviting her to the celebration, offering her a chance at redemption she probably didn't deserve. Eleanor wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her resentment, but she was tired. Tired of being isolated, tired of the Cold War with James, tired of her son's disappointment. She accepted the invitation, though she had no idea what she'd say when she came face to face with the woman she'd wronged so deeply. The night of the dinner was clear and cold, stars brilliant against the winter sky, and Eleanor drove to the restaurant alone, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. This would be one of the hardest things she'd ever done, but for once in her life, she was going to try to do the right thing. The celebration dinner was intimate, despite the magnitude of the achievement. Just 50 guests, including Daniel's father, the ranch hands who'd supported Margaret from the beginning, the young cooks she'd trained, community members who'd become friends, and a few carefully selected food journalists. Margaret had designed a tasting menu that told the complete story of her journey. Orphan's Breakfast, featuring elevated versions of the first meal she'd cooked for the ranch hands. Betrayal, with ingredients that started bitter and became sweet. Transformation, showcasing her technical growth, and Home, ending with her father's apple pie, perfect and traditional and filled with love. Each course was presented with a story, and by the time guests reached dessert, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. People weren't just tasting food, they were experiencing Margaret's life, her pain, her triumph, and her grace. When Eleanor entered the restaurant, a hush fell over the room. Margaret, resplendent in a custom chef's jacket embroidered with wildflowers, looked up and met her former tormentor's eyes. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Margaret walked over, her head high and her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly, "thank you for coming." Eleanor's carefully prepared speech died in her throat, replaced by something more honest and raw. "I don't deserve this invitation," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't deserve your courtesy or your kindness. I treated you abominably, Margaret. I said cruel things, did cruel things, and tried to destroy your spirit because I couldn't accept that my narrow worldview was wrong." Tears began to fall, and Eleanor made no attempt to hide them. "I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for every hateful word, every dismissal, every time I made you feel less than the extraordinary person you are. You didn't deserve any of it, and I was wrong about everything." The apology hung in the air, and Margaret felt the ghost of her 18-year-old self, devastated and lost and desperate for any kindness, whisper that this was what she'd needed 2 years ago, that Eleanor should have to do more than apologize to earn forgiveness. But Margaret was no longer that grieving girl. She was a woman who'd learned that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. That grace was the ultimate power move, that she could acknowledge harm without letting it define her. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said carefully, "I appreciate your apology. I won't say it doesn't matter, because it did matter. Your words hurt me deeply when I was already in pain. But I've learned that carrying hatred is exhausting, and I refuse to let what you did take up any more space in my heart." She gestured to a seat. "You're welcome here. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be the kind of person who offers grace even when it's hard. And because your husband and son love you, despite your mistakes, and they deserve to have their family whole again." Eleanor sank into the chair, overwhelmed by Margaret's maturity and kindness. James appeared at his wife's side, his hand gentle on her shoulder, his expression a mixture of relief and hope. Daniel joined Margaret, his arm around her waist, his pride in her visible to everyone in the room. The family tableau was imperfect but healing, proof that even deep wounds could begin to close with honesty and effort. The dinner continued with champagne toasts and heartfelt speeches. Tommy Rodriguez stood, his voice gruff with emotion. "I've worked ranches for 40 years, and I've never met anyone with more heart than Margaret Coleman. She took the worst thing that ever happened to her and turned it into beauty. She's proof that where you start doesn't determine where you finish, and that kindness will always win in the end." To Margaret. The room erupted in applause and raised glasses. Robert Chen spoke about Margaret's technical brilliance and emotional intelligence, her ability to honor tradition while pushing boundaries. James Whitmore talked about watching a frightened girl become a powerful woman, about being proud to call her his daughter-in-law. And Daniel simply said, "Margaret taught me that love means seeing someone exactly as they are and celebrating every part of them. She's the best thing that ever happened to me, and I'm grateful every day that she chose me too." By the time Margaret stood to speak, emotions were running high and hearts were full. She looked around the room at faces illuminated by candlelight, at people who'd supported her and believed in her and helped her build this impossible dream. 2 years ago, she began, her voice steady and clear, "I stood in a cemetery burying my parents, and I thought my life was over. I thought losing them meant losing everything, my home, my identity, my future. And for a while, I did lose those things. I experienced cruelty that tried to convince me I was worthless, that my body was wrong, that I should be grateful for crumbs and silence." She paused, making eye contact with Eleanor, who was crying openly now. "But I survived. More than that, I learned something crucial, that my worth was never determined by someone else's opinion. My body, which I was told was a problem to be solved, turned out to be strong enough to work 18-hour days creating art. My heart, which was broken and bruised, turned out to be resilient enough to love again and trust again. And my dreams, which seemed impossible, turned out to be just the beginning." Margaret's voice grew stronger, filling the room with conviction. "This restaurant isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. It belongs to my parents, who taught me that food is a language of love. It belongs to the ranch hands who left wildflowers in my kitchen and protected me when they could. It belongs to James, who saw my potential and gave me a chance. And it belongs to Daniel, who taught me that I deserved to be loved exactly as I am. without changing or shrinking or apologizing. She raised her glass to second chances, to people who lift others up instead of tearing them down, to building something beautiful from broken pieces. And to anyone who's ever been told they're not enough, you are. You always were. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The applause was thunderous. People rising to their feet, wiping tears, celebrating not just Margaret's culinary achievement, but her triumph over adversity and her grace in victory. Eleanor approached Margaret after the speeches ended, her mascara smudged, and her carefully constructed composure completely shattered. "Margaret," she said quietly, "I know an apology isn't enough. I know I can't undo the damage I caused, but I want you to know that watching you tonight, seeing what you've built and who you've become, has forced me to confront things about myself I've avoided for years." She took a shaky breath. "I was raised to believe that appearance was everything, that controlling how others perceived me was the only power I had. I made your body the target of my own fears and insecurities, and that was unforgivable. You deserved protection and compassion after losing your parents, and I gave you cruelty instead. I'm ashamed of who I was, and I'm trying to become someone better." Margaret studied the older woman, seeing genuine remorse and the beginning of real change. "Mrs. Whitmore, healing isn't linear, and becoming a better person takes work. I hope you do that work. I hope you examine why you felt the need to diminish others to feel powerful. And I hope you use whatever influence you still have to lift people up instead of tearing them down." She extended her hand. "I forgive you, not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger would poison the beautiful life I've built. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means I'm choosing peace over pain." Eleanor took Margaret's hand, holding it like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve your grace, but I'm grateful for it. And I promise I'll try to be worthy of it." The reconciliation wasn't perfect or complete. Those things take time and sustained effort, but it was a beginning. James watched his wife and Margaret shake hands, and for the first time in months, he felt hope for his marriage. Daniel pulled Margaret close, kissing her temple and whispering, "I'm so proud of you. Not just for the stars, but for being who you are, generous and strong and unwilling to let bitterness win." Margaret leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "I learned it from you," she said softly. "You showed me what it looks like to do the right thing, even when it's hard. You defended me when I couldn't defend myself. You believed in me before I believed in myself. This success is as much yours as mine." Daniel shook his head. "No. I opened some doors, but you walked through them. You did the work, created the art, built the business. I just had the privilege of watching you become who you were always meant to be." They stood together in the restaurant Margaret had built from grief and determination, surrounded by people who loved them and felt the kind of contentment that comes from surviving fire and emerging transformed. The journey from orphaned girl to celebrated chef had been brutal and beautiful, filled with loss and love, humiliation and triumph. And Margaret knew with absolute certainty that every painful step had been worth it. In the months following the celebration, Coleman's Kitchen continued to thrive, with reservations booked 6 months in advance and food pilgrims traveling from around the world to experience Margaret's cuisine. But Margaret's greatest pride wasn't the accolades or the celebrity. It was the scholarship program that had sent 12 young people to culinary school, the job training program that had helped 37 women rebuild their lives, and the community kitchen that served over 15,000 free meals to families in need. She had used her success as a platform for change, proving that excellence and compassion could coexist, that you could be wildly successful without stepping on others to get there. Sarah's table had expanded to 3 locations, creating jobs and opportunities across Montana. Margaret had hired a management team to run daily operations, freeing herself to focus on menu development, mentorship, and advocacy work. She gave speeches about body positivity in professional environments, about creating workplace cultures built on respect rather than fear, about the importance of giving people second chances. Her story resonated with people who'd been told they were too much or not enough, too poor or too fat or too different to achieve their dreams. She became a symbol of resilience, proof that your circumstances don't define your destiny and that transformation is always possible if you refuse to give up. Margaret and Daniel's wedding took place 2 years after the celebration dinner in that same mountain meadow where he'd first proposed. It was a small ceremony, 50 guests, the same number who'd celebrated her 3rd Michelin star, with James officiating and Eleanor sitting quietly in the front row. Her relationship with the couple tentatively rebuilt through consistent effort and genuine change. Margaret wore a custom dress that celebrated her curves rather than hiding them, ivory silk that moved like water and made her feel like the goddess Daniel always told her she was. She walked herself down the aisle, honoring her independence and the journey she'd made alone. And when she reached Daniel, his eyes were wet with happy tears. "You're beautiful," he whispered as she took his hands. "You've always been beautiful, but today you're radiant." They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises about partnership and respect and choosing each other every day. Daniel promised to always see her, truly see her, and to challenge any voice, internal or external, that tried to make her feel small. Margaret promised to let herself be loved, to accept his support without guilt, and to build a life together that honored both their dreams. When James pronounced them married, the meadow erupted in cheers, and Margaret kissed her husband under Montana's endless sky, feeling joy so complete it seemed to fill the whole valley. The reception was held at the ranch, in a barn James had renovated specifically for the occasion, and featured a feast Margaret had designed to honor everyone who'd shaped her journey. She served her mother's recipes alongside dishes that showcased her classical training, creating a menu that was both nostalgic and forward-looking, traditional and innovative. The ranch hands ate alongside James's business associates, Margaret's culinary school graduates alongside food critics from major publications, proving that good food and good company transcend social barriers. Eleanor gave a toast that surprised everyone. "Margaret, I once believed that a person's value could be measured by their appearance, their connections, their conformity to my narrow standards. You taught me, painfully deservedly, how wrong I was. You've shown this community that greatness comes in all forms, that kindness is strength, that grace is power. My son chose well when he chose you, and I'm honored to call you my daughter-in-law. Thank you for giving me the chance to become a better person." The years that followed were full and purposeful. Margaret published a cookbook that became a bestseller, donating all proceeds to culinary education programs. She opened a 4th restaurant, this one in partnership with indigenous chefs, focused on elevating and honoring Native American foodways. She served as a judge on cooking competition shows, using her platform to advocate for contestants who faced discrimination. She and Daniel started a family, 3 children born over 6 years, each one taught from infancy that bodies come in all shapes and sizes, and all are equally worthy of love and respect. Margaret breastfed her babies without shame, wore a bikini to the community pool without apology, and modeled for her daughters and son what it looked like to inhabit your body with confidence and joy. Coleman's Kitchen maintained its 3 Michelin stars, with Margaret's protégés eventually taking over daily operations so she could focus on her growing family and her advocacy work. The restaurant became a destination for people seeking not just excellent food, but proof that transformation is possible, that cruelty doesn't have to win, that underdogs can become champions. Margaret kept photos of her parents in the kitchen, and every night before service, she touched their frames and whispered, "Thank you." They had given her the foundation, the skills, the confidence, the love that had made everything else possible. Their deaths had been devastating, but their legacy lived on in every dish she created, every person she mentored, every act of grace she extended to those who'd wronged her. On the 5th anniversary of Coleman's Kitchen's opening, Margaret stood in the dining room after service, looking at the framed reviews and awards covering the walls. 3 Michelin stars, James Beard Award, World's Best Female Chef. But her eyes lingered longest on a different frame, a photo of her parents taken at the ranch 20 years earlier, young and happy and full of hope for their daughter's future. Beside it was the first dollar bill the restaurant had earned and a handwritten note from Tommy Rodriguez. "You did it, kid. You really did it." Daniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Margaret leaned back into his embrace, feeling grateful for the 1,000th time that she'd found a partner who saw her completely and loved her unconditionally. "I'm thinking about how strange life is," she said. "How the worst thing that ever happened to me, losing my parents, led directly to the best things. This restaurant, our marriage, the work I get to do. None of it would have happened if my life had gone according to plan." She turned in his arms, looking up at his face. "I'm thinking that Eleanor tried to break me by humiliating me, by making me feel worthless, by attacking my body and my dreams. And instead, she accidentally gave me the fuel I needed to build something extraordinary. Her cruelty didn't destroy me, it refined me like fire refining gold." Daniel kissed her forehead gently. "You refined yourself, Margaret. You chose grace over bitterness. You chose excellence over resentment. You chose to build rather than destroy. Eleanor's cruelty was the catalyst, but your character was the reason you survived and thrived." Margaret thought about the girl she'd been, 18, orphaned, terrified, convinced she deserved nothing better than a hot attic and daily insults. She thought about the moment she'd found her anger, her voice, her spine. She thought about Daniel believing in her before she believed in herself, about James extending a hand when he didn't have to, about the ranch hands leaving wildflowers and offering protection. She thought about every person who told her she was too fat to succeed, too poor to matter, too ordinary to achieve extraordinary things. And she thought about proving them wrong, not through revenge, but through excellence, not by becoming small, but by taking up space unapologetically. "Come on," she said to Daniel, taking his hand. "Let's go home to our babies. I want to tuck them in and tell them the story of how their mama went from sleeping in an attic to owning one of the best restaurants in the world." Daniel grinned. They loved that story, especially the part where their father swept their mother off her feet with a carriage ride and excellent timing. Margaret laughed. "That's your version. In my version, I swept you off your feet with a perfect apple pie and a backbone made of steel." They walked out into the Montana night hand in hand, heading home to the life they'd built together. Behind them, Coleman's Kitchen stood as a monument to resilience, to the power of talent combined with determination, to the radical idea that you could be fat and successful and loved and happy. It stood as proof that where you begin doesn't determine where you end, that cruel people don't get to write your story, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and loving deeply. Margaret Coleman had transformed humiliation into honor, pain into purpose, and grief into grace. She had won not by becoming who Eleanor Whitmore thought she should be, but by becoming more fully herself. And that, she thought, as she and Daniel drove home under the stars, was the truest victory of all. Margaret Coleman's story didn't end with Michelin stars or a fairy tale wedding, or even the beautiful family she built with Daniel. It continued every day in the young cooks she trained, the women she employed, the community she fed, and the example she set. She proved that your body doesn't limit your dreams, your belief in yourself does. She showed that grace is more powerful than revenge, that excellence is the best response to cruelty, and that loving yourself exactly as you are is a revolutionary act in a world that profits from your insecurity. Her parents would have been proud, not just of her success, but of her kindness, her integrity, and her refusal to let hardship make her hard. If this story moved you, If Margaret's journey resonated with your own struggles or gave you hope that transformation is possible, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share your thoughts about second chances, about standing up to bullies, about building something beautiful from broken pieces. Your story matters too, and your voice deserves to be heard. Remember, you don't have to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You don't have to apologize for taking up space. You don't have to wait for permission to pursue your dreams. You are enough exactly as you are, right now. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of people who refuse to stay small, who turn pain into power, who prove that underdogs can become champions. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story of triumph over adversity, of grace defeating cruelty, of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things. Thank you for spending this hour with Margaret Coleman. I'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, your beginning doesn't determine your ending. You get to write the next chapter. Make it count.